Welcome back. We're finishing the messiest part: stings, informants, and who actually manufactures crime. And the real fight is whether police are exposing intent or planting temptation. Because those are not the same thing at all, even if people pretend they are. One side says free will, the other side says a room full of pressure and a bad idea. And somehow everybody still thinks they are the innocent one. The first thing that jumps out is how much the whole thing becomes about incentives. Like if you keep rewarding big busts, people will start chasing trophies. And that is where the line gets ugly, because the public wants safety, not ego. But then the counter is simple. If a guy can walk away, why didn't he? Which is the oldest courtroom argument in history, basically. You could have said no is powerful until the setup gets very specific. That's why entrapment arguments never die, because pressure is not always visible on paper. But the other side keeps saying the same thing. Nobody gets forced to commit a crime. So the whole conversation becomes about intent, not just action. Which is hilarious, because everybody in that room thinks intent is obvious until it's them. The informant debate was even nastier, though. Paid informants are the kind of thing that makes everybody suspicious immediately. And honestly, can you blame people when money and freedom are sitting on the table? Because if someone is facing serious time, that deal becomes a survival play. Not exactly a pure search for truth, more like Panic with Paperwork. Panic with Paperwork is insane, but that's kind of the vibe. What I thought was interesting is how both sides admitted informants can be useful and dangerous. That is the real tension. You need them, but you never fully trust them. And if you pay them, you are absolutely creating incentive to say whatever helps them. Even when there are checks and corroboration, the doubt never disappears. The cop side kept saying, "We verify everything, we do not just run with a story." And that is fair, because if a case is lazy, it gets destroyed anyway. Nobody wants their whole department embarrassed by one sloppy witness. But the ex-mob side kept coming back with real-life examples of people lying for deals. And that is what made it feel less like theory and more like trauma. He wasn't talking about abstract corruption, he was talking about his family. That changes the temperature fast. Because once you believe your brother testified falsely, the whole system becomes personal. Then every paid informant looks like a setup waiting to happen. The weirdest part was the repeated clash over promotions and ego. One guy says big cases get people rewarded, the other says that does not mean corruption. And both can be true in different places, which is annoying but real. Human beings love a trophy almost as much as they love pretending they do not. That is why the conversation about organized crime and law enforcement kept looping back to motivation. Are you chasing public safety or are you chasing career points? Ideally both, which sounds noble and suspicious at the same time. That's the whole problem with power, man. And then there was the fear discussion, which got weirdly philosophical. Because the mafia argument was basically, fear is part of every hierarchy. And the law enforcement reply was, sure, but we should not build our culture around that. That is a real difference, even if they overlap more than either side wants to admit. The mob side kept saying fear was not the driver, just an element. They were saying brains, timing, loyalty, and survival mattered more. Which is a much better sales pitch than "we were all terrified." Obviously, nobody is putting that on a banner. But the law enforcement side pushed back hard with the uniform argument. Like even police presence creates fear, whether intentional or not. And that is where the conversation got smart, because it was no longer just about the mob. It became about what institutions do to people psychologically. A badge, a gun, a name, a reputation, a rumor. And suddenly everybody is moving inside a field of fear they did not fully choose. The most honest moment was probably when both sides admitted the overlap. Like, yeah, both jobs involve walking into rooms where people are nervous. Which is a wild thing to bond over, honestly. But it makes the whole debate less cartoonish. Because then it is not heroes versus villains, it is systems versus incentives. And systems always get messy when the people inside them want credit. Credit is basically gasoline for bad decisions. That should be a poster in every office. What I liked is that nobody stayed perfectly rigid the whole time. The former cop conceded some corruption happens higher up. The organized crime side admitted not every arrest or indictment was fake. That matters, because real conversation only starts when people give up the all-or-nothing act. Nothing ruins a good argument like nuance, apparently. And honestly, the stronger claim here is not that one side was pure. It is that both sides showed how quickly power can bend procedure. That is the uncomfortable part nobody likes to sit with. If a sting exposes a real criminal willingness, that is one thing. If it manufactures a crime that needed a push, that is another. And the problem is those lines can blur in real life really fast, especially when money, promotion, revenge, or survival are all in the room. Basically, the four horsemen of a terrible case file. That's awful, but yes. So if I boil the whole episode down, it is this. Power always tells itself a story. Police say they are creating safety, organized crime says it is surviving, and informants say they are saving themselves. And somewhere in the middle is the truth, getting crushed under all that motivation. That is what made this final episode hit so hard. It was not really about one case, it was about the machinery behind every case. Who benefits, who breaks, who lies, and who gets to call it justice. Tiny question, huge headache. The biggest headache, actually. That's a wrap on the series, and honestly, this one earned the chaos. We went from stings to informants to fear, and none of it was simple. That is probably why it stayed interesting the whole way through. All right, we'll leave it there before somebody gets voted out again. Welcome back, this is the final episode, and we are still in the mess of stings, informants, and who really benefits. The argument today is basically whether police expose intent or quietly manufacture it. And somehow every path leads to somebody saying, no, you are the corrupt one. That is the whole emotional engine here, right? Everyone thinks the other side is gaming the system. The weird part is both sides keep pointing at the same incentives. Right. Like promotions, big cases, and public pressure all being part of it. And nobody wants to admit that human beings love a trophy case. That is exactly where the sting debate gets ugly. Because if you create the opportunity, are you exposing a criminal or nudging one? That line is blurry on purpose, and that is what drives everybody crazy. On one side, the cops say a suspect can always walk away. On the other side, the defense says if the government manufactured the whole doorway, that matters. Basically, the legal version of, you brought the temptations, bro. And the counter is always, you still chose to step in. That argument never dies because free will is doing so much work here. But the power imbalance is real too. If the government sets the scene, picks the moment, and pays the middleman, the ethics get muddy fast. And then you get the classic line, we just gave them a chance to reveal themselves. Which is a very clean sentence for a very dirty process. Clean sentences usually hide the grime. The informant piece might be even messier than the sting piece. Because now you are dealing with somebody who has a reason to talk. Money, pressure, fear, revenge, all of it sitting on the table. And the debate becomes whether that makes them useful or unreliable. Honestly, both can be true at the same time, which is the annoying part. The Ex-Mafia side is basically saying, I know how these guys think. Their point is simple. Pay somebody and you might buy the lie with the truth. That is a brutal line, because it sounds paranoid until you hear the examples. And the law enforcement side keeps saying, we verify, we corroborate, we do not just trust the story. Which is fair because a system without checks is just theater. A very expensive theater. With subpoenas for props. What I liked is that they were not really arguing abstractly. They were arguing from scars, and that changes the temperature. One guy is saying, I got burned by the system. The other is saying, I have lived inside the rules long enough to know the rules matter. And neither one fully trusts the other side's story. Which, to be honest, makes for a great conversation and a terrible bridge. Then there is that whole fear discussion, which honestly got bigger than I expected. Because the mafia side is saying fear is part of every hierarchy, not just crime. And law enforcement is basically saying the uniform itself creates fear too. That part was strong because it flips the whole moral pose of the argument. The mob guy says fear keeps people in line, but it also destroys trust. The cop says the same thing can happen with policing if it turns into intimidation instead of service. Suddenly, everybody is talking about leadership like they are in a boardroom with a felony hanging over it. That is the most accurate description of the whole episode so far. What made it land is that both sides accidentally admitted some truth about power. Power works because people fear losing something. A job, a reputation, freedom, status, all of it. In one world, the fear is physical and immediate. In the other, it is institutional and wrapped in procedure. That distinction matters, but the emotion underneath is still the same. And that is why the debate never just stays legal. It becomes personal the second somebody says, "I know what really happens," which is always the sentence right before a fight starts. The part about safety versus arrests was interesting too, because one side is saying arrests are how you make streets safer. The other side is saying arrests alone do not equal safety, especially if the process is crooked. That is a real tension because people want results and also want legitimacy. Everybody wants clean hands and a solved problem, which is adorable. Human beings do love impossible requests. And then the whole thing circles back to organized crime being a different universe. Bigger names, bigger headlines, bigger incentives, bigger lies. That whole world is basically consequence management. The cop says federal cases can be driven by ego and careerism. The ex-mob guy says, "I have seen that stretch happen." And the federal side pushes back with, "Not in every case, not in every office," which is probably the most believable part of the whole thing. The truth usually hides inside the annoying middle. The middle never gets invited to the victory speech, though. What I respect is that nobody pretended the system is pure. They just disagreed on where the rot lives and who gets blamed for it. That is why the final segment hit so hard. It was not about proving one side righteous. It was about how power, fear, and money bend people in every direction, and whether the law can ever stay clean while chasing dirty people. Spoiler alert, that question is still undefeated. For the final takeaway, I think that is it. The machinery matters as much as the headline. Stings are not automatically evil, and informants are not automatically saints. Fear can keep order, and fear can also corrupt order. Basically, every answer came with a trapdoor, which is the perfect way to end a two-parter this chaotic. Thanks for staying with us through the whole thing. We will leave it there before we get voted out by the audience, too. Welcome back. This one is about stings, informants, and whether fear keeps order or just poisons it. And somehow this got personal, political, and a little insane. Because the real fight is not crime versus no crime, it is who is actually manufacturing the moment. Right, and everybody thinks they are the honest one in the room. That is the problem. The room is full of people saying, "Trust me, I know the system." The wild part is how quickly this becomes about incentives instead of morals. Like, are you catching intent, or are you creating opportunity and then calling it justice? Because those are very different shirts to wear to court. And the former cop's argument is basically, "I know the street, people will stretch for promotion," which is such a brutal accusation to throw at an entire system. But the answer from the other side was not exactly comforting either. They were saying, "We check it, we verify it, and if it is weak, it dies." That sounds clean on paper, but paper has never been arrested. Paper is undefeated in theory and useless in the real world. What I liked was how quickly the conversation moved from arrests to safer streets. Because that is really the public question, not how many badges got a trophy. Nobody at home is like, "Fantastic, but how many promotions did the case generate?" That is not exactly the neighborhood block party concern. The ex-cop kept insisting the arrest record reflects work ethic. And you can see why that would make people uncomfortable fast. Because if 100 arrests is seen as hustle, what stops someone from chasing numbers? That is where the ethical crack starts showing. But the federal side pushed back hard and said organized crime is a different beast. And to be fair, that distinction matters. Because once you are talking about racketeering, big names, wire work, and long investigations, the stakes change. The ego changes too, which is never a small thing. Nothing like a giant headline to make everyone discover ambition. But then the debate got stuck on informants, and that was the real pressure point. Are paid informants a necessary evil or a built-in lie machine? The former mob guy was basically saying, if you pay them and promise them freedom, of course they will bend. And he was not saying that like a theory, he was saying it like scar tissue. That difference matters a lot. He kept bringing it back to family, jail, retaliation, and survival. In his head, the incentive structure was obvious because the whole life is built on leverage. And the law enforcement side kept saying, we do not just take their word and run. That is the core tension, because both sides are describing the same machine differently. One calls it corruption, the other calls it corroboration. That is a very expensive vocabulary difference. The red light argument was ridiculous and also kind of brilliant. because they were fighting over a tiny example to prove a huge principle. Can an officer break a rule in pursuit of a bigger goal and still be justified? Or does the moment you cross that line, the system has already lost part of its authority? That was such a clean collision between street logic and legal logic. And of course, nobody wanted to concede the sentence, which made it even funnier. Words have meanings became the catchphrase of the whole exchange. The most revealing part, honestly, was how much of this came down to distrust. The mob side does not trust paid witnesses, and the police side does not trust self-interested criminals. Which means everybody is walking in with a knife behind their back, just different knives. That is the most elegant way to describe this mess. And the fear conversation tied all of it together in a way I did not expect. Because both worlds use fear, just with different uniforms. The mob guy said fear and intimidation are part of the culture, but not the whole engine. And the officer said the same thing about policing, just much more carefully. Everybody wants the other side to admit they are basically the same species. And nobody wants to say it first because that would ruin the fun. The deeper disagreement was whether fear creates success or just keeps people obedient. That is actually a huge distinction because those are not identical things. One side says fear keeps the hierarchy stable. The other says success comes from brains, patience, and knowing the system. And both probably have a piece of the truth. But the part that hit hardest was the idea that fear can get transferred. Like the mob fears the government when the penalties become bigger than the code. That is a really interesting power shift. Because it suggests institutions do not just punish crime, they reroute fear. Which is a deeply depressing sentence, but also a pretty accurate one. And the whole time, both men kept circling one issue without fully surrendering it. Are we judging outcomes or methods? Because if you only judge outcomes, people start excusing ugly methods. But if you only judge methods, you can ignore reality and let bad actors roam. That is why the debate never really ends. It just gets better dressed. What also stood out was how much both sides respected hard work, even while accusing each other of gamesmanship. That was a little surprising, honestly. The mob guy respected the grind of investigations, and the officers respected the reality of organized crime work. So underneath the shouting, there was weird mutual respect hiding in a trench coat. That is absurdly accurate. And that may be the final takeaway from the whole thing. The system is messy because the people inside it are ambitious, frightened, and self-interested. But the answer is not pretending those motives do not exist. The answer is building rules strong enough to survive them, which is much harder than yelling about the bad guys. Sadly, yelling is free and accountability is not. That is a brutal place to land, but I think it is honest. We will leave it there for the final episode. Thanks for staying with us through both parts. And thanks for surviving the chaos without getting voted out. Until next time, keep the questions sharper than the slogans. Welcome back. This last stretch is all about stings, informants, and who actually manufactures the mess. And the ugly question is whether enforcement exposes intent or quietly invents it. Because if the system rewards big cases, people start chasing the prize, not the truth. Which is where everybody suddenly becomes very noble on camera. But then the room gets messy fast, because everyone has a different memory of what happened. Yeah, and the tension here is insane because one side says free will ends the argument. The other side says the offer itself can be the crime's engine. Classic legal system behavior, making philosophy sound like paperwork. Do you buy the idea that a sting is just an opportunity someone can refuse? Or does the setup itself bend the odds too far? I think that distinction matters because opportunity and temptation are not the same thing. But in the real world, people are not angels waiting for perfect conditions. If they were, there would be no shows like this and no cases at all. Still, if police or informants create a crime that never would have existed, that is not nothing. Right, and that is where the debate gets heated, because law enforcement hates being told they wrote the script. Which is fair, because nobody likes being accused of movie villain behavior. But the counter is brutal too. If someone walks away, the crime does not happen. Unless the pressure is the whole point, and the walk-away is just theoretical. That is what makes confidential informants so slippery. They are always inside the story, but never innocent in the story. Nobody joins that ecosystem because they love honest bookkeeping. That was a painful sentence, but yes, exactly. So when one side says paid informants always lie, what do you make of that? I think that is too absolute, but it comes from real pain, not theory. And pain is loud, which is why it dominates these conversations. The other side keeps saying checks and balances should catch the lies. But that sounds comforting only if the checks are actually working. Exactly, because every system sounds clean when you describe it from 10,000 feet. On the ground, it is more like grease, paperwork, and somebody screaming about a wire. And then there is the weird moral split on promotions and incentives. One side says big arrests are career fuel, the other says that is insulting and false. Honestly, both can be true depending on the institution and the ego in the room. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud, because it ruins the clean hero story. And clean hero stories are easier to sell than boring institutional incentives. The strongest point from the enforcement side is that structure matters more than personality. Standards, verification, corroboration, all of that boring stuff actually matters. The weakest point is pretending bad actors never bend those standards for a headline case. And the strongest point from the ex-mob side is that experience can expose what theory hides. But the weakest point is making every bad outcome proof that the entire system is rotten, which is basically the human condition in a trench coat. The fear conversation was almost the most revealing part for me, because both worlds seem to run on fear, just in different uniforms. And that is what made the argument dangerous, because it was almost too easy to compare them. In policing, fear is supposed to come from authority and consequence, not personal vengeance. In the Mafia, fear is part of the brand, part of the structure, part of the mythology. Very efficient business model if your whole customer experience is terror. Terrible marketing, though. The interesting pushback was that fear alone does not create success in either world. It can control behavior, but control is not the same thing as competence. That is such a good distinction because it strips the glamour off both sides. A lot of people rise because they are smart, disciplined, and relentless. And a lot of people rise because they know how to weaponize fear, which means the same ladder can reward talent and brutality at once. That is probably why nobody in the room ever fully gave ground. They would agree in part, then immediately reload the argument. And honestly, that made the whole thing better, because the disagreement stayed alive. Did you notice how often they kept coming back to the same word, though? Oath. Everybody had an oath, and everybody thought the other side was betraying theirs. That is the real collision here, not just crime versus law. It is competing ideas of loyalty, legitimacy, and who gets to define betrayal. And once that gets personal, every policy argument turns into a family fight, which is why it was never going to stay polite for long. Still, there was one uncomfortable truth running through all of it. The system is only as honest as the people using it. And that is the sentence nobody wants, because it puts the burden back on humans. Whether it is a sting, a CI, or a promotion system, the tool is not the whole story. The question is what kind of people are trusted to use it, and whether the system notices when they start using it for themselves. That is the final gut punch, because there is no clean answer. There is only better process, better oversight, and less fantasy. Sadly, fantasy is still the easiest thing to fund. That is our last pass through the mess, and I think the mess stayed honest. Thanks for riding with us through both episodes and all the arguments inside them. We promised chaos, and honestly, the room delivered more than we did. Until next time, keep asking who benefits before you believe the story. Welcome back. This one gets into stings, informants, and who actually benefits. The fight is really about whether police expose intent or manufacture it. And the room absolutely refuses to agree on anything clean. Because that is the real knife fight, right? If the government drops the opportunity, is that policing or scripting? And if the suspect walks past it, everyone suddenly calls it free will. That argument gets slippery fast because everyone sounds righteous until the paperwork shows up. The cops keep saying they cannot win on optics alone. 100 arrests looks predatory and 5 looks lazy. That is such a brutal public service trap. But the organized crime side keeps saying the bigger the target, the bigger the incentive to stretch. And that is where the conversation stops being abstract. Because then it becomes promotions, politics, and people wanting their feather in the cap. Which is a nasty human truth, honestly. But the officers push back hard on that too. They keep saying standards, checks, approvals, and courtroom review are supposed to catch the abuse. In theory, that sounds sturdy. In practice, theory has a suspiciously easy job. The informant debate was even messier because everybody had scars. One side says paid informants are lying for money, freedom, and survival. The other side says informants are filtered, checked, and cross-verified before anything matters. And both sides kept saying, basically, trust me, I have lived this. That is always the most dangerous sentence in a room like this. Because lived experience can be wisdom, but it can also be a scar talking. And the scar does not always know when it is generalizing. What I kept hearing was the same core accusation: incentive changes behavior. That is true for cops, prosecutors, informants, and criminals. Basically, money and fear are everybody's favorite bad roommates. And then the fear conversation hit even harder. The mafia side argued fear and intimidation are part of how hierarchy holds. The law enforcement side said that same fear also lives in policing, just under a different uniform. That was the wild part, because both sides were kind of admitting the mirror. Nobody wants to call themselves scary until they need the badge or the reputation to work. And then the whole question becomes whether fear is a tool or a corruption. Human beings naturally say it is a tool when they use it, and corruption when someone else does. I also liked that nobody really escaped the question of consequences. If you break the law to catch someone, the law still exists. If you pressure someone into a crime, the ethics still exist too. That tension never got solved, and that is why it stayed interesting. So the final takeaway is not clean innocence versus dirty policing. It is systems trying to justify themselves while people with real damage argue back. Which, frankly, is the most honest ending possible. Thanks for staying through both episodes and the chaos inside them. We will catch you next time with another argument nobody can fully win.